David, first of all, congratulations on some wonderful accomplishments in your career, the new CD, Use Me, and the wonderful DVD film that's been making the round of film festivals called Unsung Treasure, that I think really celebrates your career to the extent that a lot of people didn't know so much of it. And one of the things that I loved about it was your relationship with the Reverend Gary Davis in New York City and the old Greenwich Village days, and the fact that you got to know the Reverend Gary Davis and his family well, and you took guitar lessons from him. Could you tell us a bit about what that experience was like, taking guitar lessons from the Reverend Gary Davis?
Well, the lessons could last all day, and Annie would cook lunch, and they were, I mean, I was bent on learning, but the Reverend liked to fool around with you a little bit. I remember one time he was showing me a song called I'll Be All Right, which is the song that We Shall Overcome was taken from. And he played it, and at one chord I stopped him. I said, "What's that chord?" He said, "That's an E ninth." I said, "What's an E ninth?" He said, "This is an E ninth." Oh, okay. So I learned the chord, and the next time I came back about a week later. This was before I started leading him. At first I paid him for the lessons, and then in exchange I would lead him to places, churches or concerts. So I played it for him. He said, "Wait a minute, what did you play there?" I said, "I played an E ninth." He said, "What's an E ninth?" I said, "This is an E ninth." He said, "That's the wrong chord, it's a B minor." and then every time he knew I was there, he played a B minor instead of the E ninth. But if I wasn't there, he'd play an E ninth. They were almost the same chord. There's only one note different.
Yeah.
So.
Now his wife Annie, I read somewhere, didn't like him to play blues. Is that true?
Oh, that's very true. The blues was the devil's music, and Annie, if she heard it, would make him stop. She was a character too, Annie. I remember after he left the Bronx, he was doing college concerts and he started to make a little money. And he moved from a terrible hovel in the Bronx to a nice little row house in Jamaica. And I went out there, and Annie let me in and said, "Honey, I need some help." Everybody was honey. And they'd gotten a record player with a record changer, and it was the first time they'd ever had a record changer. So she said, "You know, can you show me how this thing works?" So I set it up and I showed her, and the only record they had was, I believe it was Reverend James Cleveland doing a famous sermon, "Give Me My Flowers While I'm Living." It was a famous sermon of his, if I'm not misplacing people. And so I showed her how it worked, and you know, so the record was playing, and then she said, "Thank you very much, honey. Now would you mind taking it off? It makes the Reverend sick."
Now I understand you used to go to church with the Reverend Gary Davis and his family, and the influence of church music and gospel music, and the kind of the intensity of the programming and the release of the music and the joy of the singing, I think all comes through in what you do to this day, and it must have affected what you do on stage and how you approach being on stage. Would that be an accurate comment?
I think that's true, and relating it to the Reverend was a complex guy, and he was worldly in some ways, related to earthly things, but his faith was very real, and he sang with absolute conviction. And the one thing about gospel music is the conviction and sincerity involved. And in the black churches, you give yourself to the music. It's not so much you singing. You let the music take over, and that was an important lesson. I learned a number of important lessons. When I brought the Reverend to churches, he'd usually preach, and occasionally there would be other preachers. And I believe I learned a lot about guitar playing from the various preachers I heard. to me, there's a big difference between the blues playing, for example, of white blues players and African American blues players. Eric Clapton is a fantastic player, and in that style, he's absolutely the best, and he kind of created the style. And the style is a string of notes. You don't have to take a breath on the guitar, and he rarely takes a breath. But if you listen to B.B. King and Freddie King and Albert King and the African American blues players, you find that they play a lot of rests. And I'm convinced with B.B., for example, B.B. has said that with tone he was trying to emulate Lonnie Johnson, and that can be heard. You can really detect that. With the choice of notes, that's his. That's completely individual. With the phrasing, that comes from the church. That is a preacher's phrasing. And it's true for most of the African American guitar players. And you know, that's something that I tried to learn.
It's a great observation. And also, I think the kind of the tension and release of the ceremony, where you get the sense, when I started going to some black churches in Memphis, the show really builds, and then it just goes down, and then it just starts building again.
Yes, you build to a point of it, and this is for anybody who does. You referred to it as a show. Of course, it's a ceremony, it's a service, but in many ways it's a show. And for anybody who does a show, when you reach a certain height of intensity, the only place to go is way down, and then bring it back up again. Yeah, you're exactly right. You learn that. And you learn it without realizing you're learning it.
Now, you grew up at a time in New York when the Newport Folk Festival was such an important, historically now, we look back at it, we look at the artists on the Vanguard Records reissues and some of the footage, and we see all the great rediscovered blues artists. Were you able to go to Newport and witness that?
Oh yeah, and I remember, I mean, I was very lucky. I had contact with a lot of the first generation blues and songsters. I had a 2-week gig in Philadelphia opening up for, I was accompanying a singer named Jerry Moore, who was the opening act for Mississippi John Hurt. And John and I used to sit backstage for hours and play. We just had a ball. And he actually invited me to play with him at Newport. And I'm very proud that I had the good sense to thank him and say no. Because nobody would have wanted to hear me messing up what he does. The two of us together, we had a ball, we had fun. He enjoyed it, I enjoyed it. But, you know, you want to hear Mississippi John Hurt, you want to hear Mississippi John Hurt. Yeah. So I got to know him. I did shows with Muddy Waters, that was great. And met BB a few times. Had the only two musicians that I ever had my picture taken, and my wife was with me on both occasions. We both had our pictures taken with Muddy Waters and BB King.
What I also loved about the DVD Unsung Treasure was the fact that you had members of Widespread Panic referring to the old David Bromberg big band as being an influence on what they do and the whole jam scene. And you have Sam Bush talking about you producing John Hartford, which was an influence on the newgrass scene that came along later. And it's wonderful, the eclecticism of your music over the years with the blues and as I mentioned, you know, the bluegrass and John Hartford connection and the big band, the horn section, very much in a sense New Orleans influenced, I guess, in a way. So all these things coming together in the David Bromberg band for so many years. It must have been so much fun to be on stage and probably having that sense of improvisation.
Well, these days, I run into a lot of people who say that the band influenced them, and it makes me feel wonderful. But it was really commercial suicide to perform and record so many different kinds of music on one album, because the record stores didn't know what bin to put it in. The record companies didn't know what magazines or radio stations to advertise it in. I remember doing a tour after an album came out that I did on Fantasy Records called Bandit in a Bathing Suit, and we visited different radio stations of different kinds. And we went to a rock and roll station, and I had a pretty nice tune on that album, and the people there, they said, that tune would be perfect for us, but there's nothing else like it on the whole LP, so we won't play it.
Yeah.
You know, I'm lucky if it doesn't get me in trouble. There are some promoters in the United States, very nice people, who promote both a big bluegrass festival called Gray Fox, and then a more blues-oriented thing called Rhythm and Roots. And they got upset with me because one year I was playing both of them, and at the Bluegrass Festival I played mostly blues, and at Rhythm and Roots I played mostly bluegrass. But I don't plan my sets. I don't know what I'm going to do. And it had never occurred to me that they wanted me to stick to one genre, because that's not what I do. Yeah. But next time I promised them I'd be aware, and they were very happy. So we did a whole show of bluegrass, and we're going to play the Rhythm and Roots thing, and we'll do a. I've actually been enjoying doing all blues shows and all bluegrass shows. It's kind of interesting. It's nothing I used to do, but to stand up and do an hour of blues is kind of fun.
Well, the fact that you have been so eclectic, you're a multi-instrumentalist, must have bode well for all the sessions that you did, especially for Atlantic Records, and literally hundreds of sessions with literally everybody from Bob Dylan to Flaco Jimenez and Doug Somm, and
but much more unlikely ones too.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I used to have 6 pages, 3 pages of people that I'd performed with live, and 3 pages of people I'd recorded with, and we'd put this on the table where they sold the CDs, and there but we'd only put 2, one of each, you know, and then the next night a different one. And there would be one ringer in each list where I hadn't played with that person or I hadn't recorded with them. And if you could pick out the ringer, you'd get a free CD. And if you could pick out the ringer on 2, I would kiss your butt in Main Street, broad daylight, because nobody could do that. I mean, you know, I played with, I played live with Waylon Jennings and Johnny Paycheck, and the woman who played Bessie Smith on Broadway, who was a sitcom star. I'm having a senior moment remembering her name. And Ravi Shankar. And I mean, it just gets weird.
And of course, George Harrison, and that was the first time I saw you and heard your name, was thanks to George Harrison bringing you on television, national television.
Yeah, and I remember recording in Toronto with a wonderful singer who I haven't seen since, I don't think, named Dee Higgins. I don't know if
Yes.
Yeah, and she asked me to play on her record. I was flattered and had a great time. And I did a track or 2 with Gordon Lightfoot. They flew me up to Toronto too. Yeah. So I have a little small Canadian connection.
Dr. John is somebody that you recorded with, and I'm sure you've had many reunions with one way or another, and of course he's prominently on your CD Use Me, and I love the footage of you and Dr. John in New Orleans together, and I was just thinking, as a music fan, that must have been just so great for you to be part of that.
He was so sweet. You mentioned before the Atlantic sessions.
Yeah.
On most of the Atlantic sessions that I did were produced by Arif Mardin, who was one of the greatest producers who ever lived. He's gone now. He produced the first couple of Norah Jones records as far as recent stuff goes, but he produced Danny O'Keefe, and I don't know if he did Aretha sessions. He did Donny Hathaway. He did, you know, so many people. And usually when he would call me, he would also call Mac Rebennack, Dr. John. And I think that we were his seasoning, you know. To be a good studio musician, you have to play well enough to put some beauty into the background and not stick out like a sore thumb. It's not your opportunity to to shine. You have to make the singer shine, which results after a while in your playing becoming a little vanilla. And Mac could never be vanilla, and I don't think I was capable of doing anything other than the weird melange that I did. So I think he would throw us in to season it a little spice.
Did you have a hard time juggling between your session work and the live band and being on the roads? You were so active in both areas, it must have been quite the balancing act at times.
When I started to hit the road, the session work fell off quite a bit. You know, you're not in town, you don't get called.
Yeah, as mentioned in the film Unsung Treasure, hitting the road for, what was it, 16, 18 years or something?
Oh, I don't even know.
Yeah.
I do know that for one stretch I was on the road for 2 years without being home for 2 weeks.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the film refers to the fact that you kind of didn't realize it at the time, but eventually looking back on it, it was kind of a burnout experience.
Well, I did get burnt out, and I was too dumb to realize it was burnout. What I realized was when I was home, I wasn't practicing, I wasn't writing, and I wasn't jamming. I never thought I could get burnt out, so burnout didn't enter the picture. I just looked at that and I said, there's nothing of a musician there. I suppose I'm no longer a musician. And I didn't want to be one of these guys who drags himself on stage and does a very bitter imitation of what he used to love. I didn't like that when I saw it, so I decided to find another way to live my life, and I literally stopped playing for 22 years.
And that's when you found a love of the violin.
Yeah.
And I gather that kind of started almost at one phase ended, and then the violin phase kicked in. And did you have a huge love of violin playing and the instrument before that?
I've been privileged to work with a lot of great fiddlers.
Yeah.
And I remember at one point, I played a lot of fiddle tunes on guitar. That's part of the bluegrassy side of what I did. And I remember thinking at one time, you know, if I had a fiddle, I know what I'd want to sound like. So I decided to try and teach myself fiddle. And then I got interested in the instrument itself. And when I was living, when I stopped performing, I was living in Northern California. And when I wasn't on the road, the intellectual stimulation that I found was in a violin making shop. And it used to fascinate me how someone with some experience could look at a violin, not refer to the label because they're very frequently wrong, but he'd look at the outside of the violin and tell you where and when it was made and sometimes by whom. And I wanted to be able to do that. So to that end, to be able to learn how to look at the violins, I went to graduated from violin making school, and then proceeded to study fine violins to gain some expertise. And that's what I do now. In one small, insignificant part of the violin world, I'm the world's expert when it comes to violins made in the United States. Nobody thought there were any good ones, and of course there were.
And you have the largest collection of American-made violins.
Well, and there's no equivalent collection of French, Italian, English, German, Spanish violins. It's really a unique collection, yeah. And it proved my point.
I love the fact that you've referred yourself to a living link between the Reverend Gary Davis and Mississippi John Hurt and so many of the other country blues artists. And I love the fact that you're carrying on and continue to spread that word. And I guess in a sense it's something, an idea that you keep alive when you perform and talk to people.
I hope I keep it alive in sincerity in the music. I don't perform. I don't think I'm doing any Mississippi John Hurt tunes, and I do a couple of Reverend Gary Davis tunes occasionally. My shows are unpredictable even to me, and I do my own tunes, but rarely. I usually forget to do my own tunes, and I do music from all the genres I like, the tunes that seem to fit me, and I have the attitude that while I'm doing them, they belong to me. When I'm done, they can go back to the real authors.
I love the fact that Levon Helm appears on 2 tracks of your new CD, Use Me. And And another artist that in many ways, I guess you probably share a long history with. How long did that go back with Levon Helm?
It goes back to when the band first was on the road. We'd run into each other everywhere. My best friend in the group was Rick Danko, the bass player, and he was also Levon's best friend. And they were wonderful, warm humans, both of them, and they're both gone. And it's a huge loss.
And I love the fact that Levon does an old Memphis Jug Band tune on your CD, because there's something that goes way back too.
Well, what happened was Levon agreed to, first let me explain what this CD is about. A lot of the reviewers will write, oh, he got a bunch of his friends to play on it. That was the least of it. I called up a bunch of people and I asked each of them to write a song for me, and then to produce the session of me performing the song, Use Me. That's why it's called Use Me. Not because, as an afterthought, I recorded the song Use Me, you know, the Bill Withers tune, but that was after everything else was done. With Levon, it was difficult because he had just had some surgery on a benign tumor on his vocal cords, and he wasn't allowed to speak. So there's no way I could get a song from him. And there was no way he himself could produce the session. So Larry Campbell, who was his right hand for decades, and I'm proud to say a good friend of mine, agreed to produce the sessions, and Levon, of course, was ready to play. And picking the material, you know, every other tune, the artist picked the material, but I couldn't get Levon to suggest some things because he couldn't speak. I suppose he could have written a list, but we didn't go there. So Larry said, let's do one of your tunes. So I sent him a tape of a blues that I'd written, and he wrote great horn parts for it and got the musicians and produced the session and did a fantastic job. But on my drive up to Woodstock, I said, you know, I really should have picked something that's more in line with what Levon records these days. So I thought of that old jug band tune, Bring It With You When You Come. And as everybody left, the horn section left, I grabbed the bass player and Levon. I said, let's do this one, just the four of us. You know, Larry, Levon, me, and the bass player, and we did Bring It With You When You Come.
Mm-hmm. And being in New Orleans, recording with Dr. John at the Pie Tree Studios, is that how you pronounce it?
Piety Street.
Piety Street, yeah. Being such a musicologist and fan, being in New Orleans must have special significance to you, just to be in that atmosphere.
It's good to leave the United States every now and then. And yeah. New Orleans has never felt like America to me. I mean, it is America. It doesn't. Maybe I should say it's never felt like the United States. It's its own thing, and I love it. And especially to be there with Mac. I mean, there's no better person to be walking around the streets of New Orleans with than Mac Remenek. Yeah.
Bit of a different question. Johnny Shines, I had a huge love for his music, and I got to know him as well. And I love the record that you did on Biograph with Johnny Shines.
You're one of the very few people, aside from me and Johnny, who really liked that record, I think the people who were used to Johnny, just to explain to people, Johnny Shines was a great blues musician who probably worked with Robert Johnson more than any other human. So he knew Robert quite well, and he told some stories about Robert. But when I was asked to produce him, and I produced him the way I would have produced myself, I took each individual tune and put it in a setting I thought that fit. And Johnny said in interviews before he died, I found them both after he was gone, but he said twice in interviews that was his favorite album. And the reason I'm certain that he liked it was that I didn't put him in overalls and a bandana on top of a bale of hay. He grew with the times, and yeah, he did some of those blues all by himself on the record, but he loved playing with a good ensemble. He loved having backup singers and horns, And you know, nobody had ever done that with him.
I
And
love
he
him.
wanted it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love Mr. Covershaker.
Yeah. Great tune.
And finally, I appreciate your generosity, and I hope we're okay time-wise.
Oh, sure we are.
Yeah, great. Could you just tell us about the last phase of your life? It's so wonderful, and it's such a big part of the documentary about how you moving to Delaware and being such a big part of the community and contributing to the community in so many different ways. And I find it really inspiring, and especially the fact that you were invited to be part of this community by the mayor, and you established a business there, and then you started rediscovering your sense of loving to play music, and you're actually rebuilding there as well.
Well, I'm hoping it's not the last stage of my life. Maybe the most recent stage of my life. We lived in Chicago for 22 years, and my wife couldn't handle another Chicago winter, and I understood it, and so we decided we had to move east again. We would have liked to have gone back to New York City. We both love the city, but we couldn't afford to bring everything that we had into New York City, and, or probably anything we had into New York City. So we started looking for a place that might be a little warmer. And we weren't going to go down to the south, you know, be in the, across the Mason-Dixon line. And that's not, we're Yankees. So I had a friend who lived in Wilmington, and we were looking for a place, and the place we found, which we could actually afford, was bought by somebody else before we could get it. We had offers in, but he paid the asking price, you know, one of those deals. And then the city asked me if I'd like, told me they wanted me to come and they'd help me. And I had lunch with the mayor a couple of times, and he told me that the street that I'm on used to have live music all up and down, and he said, I'd love to see that again. And I felt I owed him, so, but what could I do? I figured the only thing I could do would be maybe start a couple of jam sessions. And I figured I'd endure them for a few months, and then they'd live or die. But some really fine musicians showed up at these jam sessions. Some of them traveled quite a distance, actually. And I started to really enjoy playing, and I started to regain some of my chops. And I decided, well, what the hell? Why not hit the road a little bit, but keep it under control this time? You know, I learned that actually I can tell people no. And I do. You know, I only play where I think I'm going to enjoy it, and because that's what this is about. If I don't enjoy it, I don't see how the crowd can possibly enjoy it. And the guys that I play with, we all have the attitude that really we're paid for getting there. Playing we do for free.
Well, it really comes across. Big smiles on stage, and I love it. So,
thank you.
David, thank you so much for doing
thank
this.
you.
I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.